All right, so my name is Justin Bennett. I'm a front-end architect, and a lot of people ask me, what does that even mean? So there's not an easy answer for that. I deal with all things UI. I'm very interested in getting products out to customers fast, making them great experiences, making them very performant, making sure that ad requirements are met and analytics requirements are met, and all the other fun things that can go along with media specifically is the industry that I work in. So I work for Scripps Networks Interactive, and we do like HGTV, Food Network. If you've seen any of those sites, Travel Channel, Great American Country, the list goes on. I've probably worked on them, and I apologize. So yeah, I'm pretty passionate about open source, spending time building meaningful products with software, because a lot of times I feel like we build things that are very sugary to the psyche, and building a better developer experience. That's one of my biggest passions, is enabling a great developer experience. So we're gonna take a short little journey and talk about HTML. Your standard HTML element, right? You have a tag, start tag, an end tag. You could potentially have some content in the middle of those tags. I'm gonna refer back to that word content later in this talk, and that's what I mean, the area of stuff that goes between the tags. You can have attributes, and you can have values. And these primitives are pretty powerful. You can build really basic things, like a button, right? It's a native primitive that we have, just this little building block. And you can build some larger experiences. So this is just GitHub's interface. And it looks kind of simple, right? I'm sure all of you have looked at it at some point. I look at it way too often, but it looks kind of simple, but it's really deceptive of how complex this UI is, right? Simple really isn't easy, and especially when you're building UI. UI is very challenging. And for the purposes of this talk, we're going to keep it really, really simple, and we're going to talk about buttons, because buttons are very nuanced. And you think, this is the easiest thing I can work on, but are they really? So we have these three primary buttons, or info buttons, or whatever they want to refer to these as. Notice we have two star buttons that have some specific action associated with them. And then we have this drop-down profile button, which actually triggers a drop-down, so it has some more interactions with it. We actually have this other button over here that would be easy to miss. So it's a primary button, but it's essentially the same sort of thing. So we're talking about these predefined groups of UI that share similar properties, but have different data. They have different display modes. And they're also contained in, these containers. They live somewhere. So these things are called components. That's the abstraction that we're going to use to describe them. If you're using any modern front-end framework, well, it's probably not, modern is a very relative term, but if you're using, something like Vue or Angular or React, you're probably familiar with the notion of components. This is actually from the React docs. I like how they describe components better than how Vue describes components. So components let you split UI into dependent, reusable pieces and think about each piece in isolation. When you're building components, specifically UI components, there are multiple classifications, but we'll talk about UI components here. You want to make sure that they're simple, that they have a clearly defined interface, things that you can interact with to power them to get some output. So we want to build kind of our own button primitive, right? So we have this like little template. So we're probably going to have a default class that we want to add to it, and I've poorly named it default here. And we want to just inject some data in this button thing, and then we want that to render kind of consistently across our app. Like GitHub has their info button, we want a similar sort of thing. So when you're building components, generally you have some sort of templates. So in React, you might have a JSX template. In Vue, you actually have a template block for your single file components. And that allows you to take this user experience, this little piece of atomic UI, this stuff that is very portable in isolation across your app, and feed it data and get out a result. So they're very much like functions, if you will. They take values. And what do we call those values? So in this case, we have a BaseButton component that we've defined, which is our kind of, you can see it rendered out on the bottom. It's our GitHub flavor default button, right? And we're giving it an attribute of text and defining some text. In this case, and in a lot of modern frameworks, well, specifically Vue and React, these will be defined as props. So again, this element looks and feels a lot like a native web element, right? So if you've used a regular button tag, this will feel very similar. It's just that you can bind these attributes to use in your actual component. Let's see how this goes. Okay, so here we have a Vue component. I'm not going to go into the details of a Vue component, but I can give you resources for that later as well. But here we have a Vue component, and it's using that base button that we said that we wanted to create earlier, right? And it's passing down some text. So this text is the attribute, or it really powers the data for the UI that we want to have rendered, right? So what does this base button look like? All right, so our base button has multiple things here. It's got a template, which is this kind of portable UI, the thing that we kind of define, that sort of reusable HTML that we want to be able to consistently reuse across our application. And then it has a props value, which is the properties. It's specifying what data is allowable in this component. What attributes on this component do I care about? As you can imagine, states for UI can get pretty complicated, especially when you talk about the state of the web and like all the things that you need to support. So I picked out a button as an example because let's just take accessibility, for example. So accessibility is something that we often don't think about primarily when we're building products. We have our main requirements and we try to hit those, and then things like accessibility and reusability and performance, and there's a lot of things that tend to like come after make it work. So being able to bundle up this logic in one place and drive it from a simple interface is very important, right? So right now we're passing in text as a property to give our button text, but we could also say, hey, I want you to take in a disabled state. So disabled state could have other things that it triggers. You could have special markup that you need to be generated for, again, accessibility or for whatever reasons. Having this base button as a primitive that takes in some properties is a very powerful thing. Now we have this building block that we can use throughout the rest of our application. So we're giving it these properties, these values, but what's to say that the values that we're providing are actually correct, right? So another example here, whereas we were looking at the base button before, this is the same component, but instead of an array of strings for props, we're giving an object. So we still are supporting the text object. So we're saying when we use this button, we want to provide an attribute that says text equals something, and we want that to populate. But we can say the type here is string, and it's a required property. So during runtime, Vue will kind of suck up this information when you're in development mode specifically, and check before it like sends these properties down. It says, is this property a string? Is it there? Is it defined? If both of those things are true, this validation will pass and we're all good. So this is a very powerful concept in development because it allows you to validate assumptions that you're making. And a lot of times in JavaScript particularly, we are very free form about what we pass to things. So if you're expecting, hey, this is always going to be a string, and I'm going to be able to access properties or methods on that string prototype, and it's not a string, then you can have an error. So it's important for your interfaces, whether you're defining an interface for a component or any other thing, to be very explicit about what they desire, what they take, what they use. And it also is good documentation, right? Another developer can come in and say, okay, I'm building a button and I see that it takes a text property and I know that it's a string and I know that it has to be there. So there's no ambiguity around the usage of that property, right? All right, so we have our button displaying some data, but if all we did with UI was display data, that wouldn't be very valuable, right? We need some sort of interaction, or it would just be an interface. So here's an example of maybe how you would attach a click handler to a native DOM element in Vue. So we have this special attribute that's @click, and we set that equal to say hi. Now, in the Vue world, this would say, I want to bind the click event of this button, and I want to call some method say hi at some other point. And I'm still passing it the click me data or text, right? So we want this similar interface. So let's pull up. Well, this is just the Vue example of this, right? So we have our button that's defined. We're saying @click, say hi. So when I click this, we'll get hi out, right? Great. So that's nice, but we're building this kind of reusable component, this reusable interface. So interestingly here, same sort of thing, same sort of setup. We have BaseButton, which is abstracted out. You don't know about the internals of it. You just know kind of what its interface is. You know that it takes some text. And in this case, we want to click on it and have something happen, right? So I'm in this parent component, which is, I'm not going to say it. Whatever the context of the parent component is doesn't necessarily matter. It's something that's using this button. In this case, it's just empty. But it's using this button and it says, hey, when you click on this, I want my method say hello to be called. Interestingly, when I click on this, nothing happens. And this is one of the things that tripped me up when I first started using Vue. So if we thought about what our BaseButton does, actually let's go back and take a look at BaseButton again. So button is just taking in some properties and displaying button. That's all it's doing. Now, when you click a button, in the browser, there's a click event that happens, and that click event will bubble up the DOM, right? So something somewhere up the DOM tree can be listening for that click event and do an action, take an action on it. But Vue's event system is not, by default, running. It's not using the native event system of the browser. It has a synthetic event system that it uses, very similar to like what React would do. So this doesn't work. Now, we can trick it into working or force it into working, I hope. Yeah, all right, so we added this .native, I don't know if they call it a selector or a specifier or what the terminology in the docs is. But basically, this is saying, hey, I want to run off of the native events of the browser. Now, we've added a new requirement to our interface here. And that makes it a little bit more challenging, right? We don't want to have to repeat this .native everywhere. It can cause bugs, right? So what we want is we want @click to just work. So I've got another component that I built here ahead of time. It's called, just think of it as the base button as well. All right, so this is just like our base button. It's taking that prompt text still. I've simplified it for this example. You should always use prompt validation. And I've given it a clicked method. And that clicked method, all it does is emits an event, right? So I'm binding that click method onto the native button element. And then when that native event happens, it triggers clicked. Now, again, a nuance with Vue. One of the things that I've noticed with this framework is there can be a lot of gotchas and corner cases. If you put an event listener on a native element, it will use native events. If you put it on a Vue element, it will not. So keep that in mind. It'll save you a lot of debugging time later. So yeah, basically this is simulating that the browser's event clicking, right? So we go back up here. I don't think it's working. I don't know why. It should be working, but we're going to say that it'll work. It worked before. Anyway, you get the picture. I'm emitting that event. I'm listening to the specific target. Now, when we think about like what this component is, so we know intuitively that a base button is a button, right? Like it's very descriptive in what it is. But when you're telling Vue, it's like, hey, I want you to click, or I want to handle the click event from this thing. Well, from Vue's perspective, it doesn't know that it's a button. It could be a button. It could be a whole interface. It could be a whole screen. It could be any number of things, right? So Vue can't make an assumption that, oh, this component's just a button. I'm going to obviously click or get the events from just this button, right? So to Vue, it's a black box as well. So that's the whole reasoning around why you have to emit those events. So we've kind of talked about the interface for parent-child communication in Vue, right? So the parent gives the child props to pass data into the component, and the child emits events to get the parent to do something, right? So this is an interesting model, right? Events are very familiar if you do a lot of web development. I mean, they're something that we deal with all the time. And props are very much like, passing parameters down to a function, right? Calling a JavaScript function. So it's very intuitive. Interestingly, I'll say React has a similar sort of setup, but it doesn't emit events. So in React, if you want a click handler, you pass the function down, your click handler function, as a property. So it's props all the way down. And if you want to communicate back up the tree, what you're doing is you're specifically passing that property down. So, there are some interesting distinctions here. So I've been asking myself a lot lately, what are the value of using events in Vue specifically? So they do hook into the dev tools. If you haven't used them yet, you should. The dev tools are amazing. But they're very implicit, right? You can't open up a Vue file and see this event section with the event's name and the types that they return and all that stuff, right? So, you have to be more careful and more cognizant about that interface. You have to do a better job of making a clear distinction of the events that you're creating and keeping track of them. So, for example, when you emit an event, you just give it a string as a name, and that's the event that's emitted. So if you make a typo and you have click and clock, right, like just a simple typo, then you're technically making two different events. So it's kind of it's an interface that's a little prone to failure. Anyway, so what about passing data as content, right? We talked about content at the beginning of the talk. So content is some stuff that you want to shove in between these two tags and just make it render that. And this is like the natural interface for a button. This is obviously how we'd want to do it, right? So yeah, there's a thing for that in Vue. It's called slots. All right, so we have this, our base button, again, and we're giving it some text, in this case jackpot. So this is more in line with how you would intuitively use a button, right? So I have another variation of our button. And in this case, when a template is defined, you're just giving it this unique HTML-like element or custom view component in this case called slot. So slot is a place that you take in content from your element or from your component when you call it, and you just inject it in, right? So in this case, we're taking that text of jackpot and we're just injecting it in between these button tags. So we get this output, right? And we could technically do whatever we wanted here. You can pass whatever content you want into the button and it will consume it. Slots enable compositional UI, right? You can take this container, you can style that container, and that container can be the thing that you always use for that sort of thing. And then you can just inject another component that defines the content. So the star button on GitHub is something that I tend to use a lot. But in this example, we have our base button, which is what we just showed, right? All it has is a slot in the center of it. And it defines the styles for what the button body itself should be, but it doesn't define anything for the content. And in this case, we're giving this star component, which is just an icon for our consideration, and then star text. So star component and star the text is what's being passed into the slot of this component. But if you rendered it empty, it would just look like this, right? So this is base button with no content. Now, imagine going back to the GitHub example of all the different iterations of buttons. So they could maintain this as the source of truth for what their button containers look like, right? This could actually have the native button element and handle any accessibility properties or any other custom hooks that you needed to have for every button in your application could be like this. And then the content could just be kind of composed into it. So there's also named slots. So before we had the attribute of just slot, and whatever content you put inside of that component would go into the slot. But you can also have named sections, right? So if you're building a menu bar, maybe you have a left section and a right section. The menu bar component itself is just concerned with where it displays and maybe some basic properties like what background color it has or whatever. And it can break down and say, I have these different sections where you can put content. But I do want to talk briefly about when to use slots and when not to use slots. So in the compositional example that I was giving here, right? BaseButton is a container and it doesn't care about its content, right? BaseButton is just defining what is the border, what is the border radius, what is the disabled state, whatever like the things that need to be on the button itself. But as far as content, it doesn't care. You could put an image, you could put text, you could put icons, you could put another button of the same type, it doesn't matter. So that's very flexible, right? But if you're wanting to provide data to something, so in this case, let's say the starter button was customizable, right? And you could give it text to override what it said. Would you want to, for the starter button, pass that down through a slot? Probably not. You can't verify that, hey, this is text like I expect it to be. Or it'd be very difficult to validate that this is a string or this has content, it has a specific length or whatever. So slots are great for making containers where you can put whatever values you need inside of those containers. But they're not great for passing specific data that you know the types for, the definitions for. So when you're making a component, when you think about the interface of a component, properties are what's driving your data. Events is how you talk to parent components, and slots is how you insert arbitrary data into a component. So I have a link to the sandbox. I also have links to the Vue.js guide, but if you want any more information about this, the Vue.js guide is awesome. So they have a prop section, they have a section on custom events, and they have a section on content distribution with slots. So check those out. As always, components are the building block of your application. So when you're working on those, be very mindful of what you're doing, because it's hard to build a solid product on a shaky foundation. But yeah, that's all I got.
So, this may be opening a can of worms. Is there any reason why you can't pass a function down to props and do a React style event callback that way?
There's not. No. I'm not convinced that that's not the right way to do it. You know, there are different things, right? So like, if you're taking that approach, you always have to pass something down to get data back up, right? Whereas with an event, you don't have to pass anything down, you can just subscribe to it. So, you know, there could be some arbitrary situation where a component needs to push data up to its parent, but I haven't found a concrete thing for that yet. And like I said previously, the fact that it's hard to validate the events, you know, that doesn't sit super well with me. So, yeah, probably the best practice.